ABC News in Washington, this is Meet the Press with Tim Russert.
Welcome again to Meet the Press. Our issue this Sunday, the religious right and the struggle for the soul of the Republican Party. Our guest, late in our program, will talk with Congressman Jim Leach of Iowa, founder of the Republican Mainstream Committee, and a rarity in the Republican Party. He still calls himself a moderate. And joining us now, the executive director of the Christian Coalition, Pat Robertson's Citizen Action Organization, Dr. Ralph Reed. Dr. Reed, welcome to Meet the Press.
Thank you, Tim.
And joining me this morning, David Broder of the Washington Post and Albert Hunt of the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Reed, is the Christian Coalition a religious or political organization?
Well, I think in a sense it's a little bit of both. I think that we're out there as an organization that is saying to evangelical Christians and their pro-life Roman Catholic allies that you need to get involved in civic affairs, you need to get involved in civic life, and what this really is an extension of their obligations as Christians to be good citizens. The Apostle Paul told the early Christians to render unto Caesar the things that were Caesar's and to exercise their civic responsibility, and what we're really saying is in a democracy, when you render unto the government that which is due it, that means your vote, your informed participation, and your involvement.
Are Jews, Muslims, or non-believers welcome?
Sure, of course. I think America is a melting pot. I think that one of the great strengths and diversities of this country is not only its faith, but the fact that we have been a refuge and a haven to other people who have left Europe or Asia because they were being oppressed. And I think it's very difficult to go, for example, to the museum at Ellis Island and not be deeply moved to see the luggage piled up and the photographs of the Czechs and the Slovaks and the Italians and the Jews and the evangelicals, the Roman Catholics, the Greek and Russian Orthodox who came to this country looking for a place where they could be free.
Let me ask you about the comments of two allies of yours. They're not members of the Christian Coalition, but they certainly have been involved in similar political activity. The Reverend Jerry Falwell said, if President Clinton does all the things he's talking about, I fear the judgment of God on America. Do you agree with that?
Well, I would probably phrase it a little differently. I think if you jump off of a building, you're going to hit the ground. Now, I don't know if that's the judgment of God or if it's just a result of certain laws that have been set into motion. I think that if you do some of the things that Bill Clinton has talked about, I think it's going to be hurtful to the family. I think it's going to ultimately hurt the economy, and I think it's going to be deleterious to our national defenses. I don't know that you really have to necessarily phrase it in terms of actual divine judgment, but I do think that the last time we had a Democratic president, we had the highest interest rates since the Civil War. We had the highest inflation since World War II. It was not a pleasant time. And I think that if Governor Clinton were to pursue those policies to their logical end, I think they could be hurtful.
Randall Terry, the head of Operation Rescue, said the vote for Bill Clinton is a sin against God. Would you take it that far?
No, I wouldn't. I would not use the word sin, which is a very theologically loaded word, and attach it to voting behavior. I think it was a mistake to vote for Bill Clinton, but I wouldn't use the word sin.
One more question about the Christian Coalition. And last year, Pat Robertson said that as soon as possible, he'd like to obtain a working majority of the Republican Party. What does that mean?
Well, I think what Pat was talking about there was having Christians, evangelicals, and pro-life Roman Catholics have a role in American civic life that is commensurate with their numbers. I mean, if you go in a 10-block perimeter around the Capitol in this city, you're going to go by the AFL-CIO that represents union workers, you're going to go by VFW that represents veterans, the NAACP represents African Americans. There are lots of buildings and institutions in this town that are permanent and respected and acknowledged and celebrated because they represent the views of their constituency. And on election day, according to network exit polls, 24 million evangelical Christians went to the polls. What we're saying is that those people have the same right to a permanent presence to represent their views as everybody else. And not, by the way, just in the Republican Party, but in the Democratic Party as well. We'd like to see a time when both parties are inclusive of our agenda and our constituents.
Of the 2,000 delegates to the Republican Convention in Houston, how many were members of the Christian Coalition?
I don't really know for sure. The press report said that there were 300, but I honestly don't know, and we don't keep track of those kind of figures.
How many would you like to have in 1996?
I don't really have a specific goal in terms of a number. Again, I want to make it clear, our goal here is not to take over either political party. Our goal is to see Christians exercising their rights and getting involved and making a difference. We see this as a positive thing. You know, we don't say, for example, that blacks have taken control of the Democratic Party just because Ron Brown happens to be black. We would never say that. Why don't we say that? Because it would be bigoted and it would be racist. And I think it displays an equal kind of prejudice to say that because Christians go out and exercise the same rights that everybody else does, that somehow this is dangerous. I think that's wrong.
David Broder.
Dr. Reed, as you know, Governor Kirk Fordyce of Mississippi stirred up a bit of a fuss 10 days ago by talking about the United States as a Christian nation. As the director of the Christian Coalition, what was your reaction to that comment?
Well, what I think is this, that there are two things that have made America great. The first is her essential moral goodness, which I think is derivative of faith. And I think it's the kind of thing that Alexis de Tocqueville was talking about in the 1830s when he visited America and said it wasn't until I went into the churches of America that I truly understood her greatness. And it is this: America is great because she is good, and if she ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great. And I think that is one of the things that has made America great, is faith in God, and that faith being practiced out in a kind of voluntary obedience, self-initiative, helping others. So I see that in a positive way. But in addition to that, as I said just a moment ago, I think an equally important pillar of our progress and our prosperity has been our diversity. So I think you've got to acknowledge the faith and say that is important and celebrate and affirm that, whether it's Martin Luther King or Pat Robertson, whoever's out there impacting public policy as a result of their faith. But you also have to acknowledge diversity and pluralism.
I like that essay, but I'm not sure that I heard whether that was an agreement or a disagreement with the characterization of the United States as a Christian nation.
Well, I think, you know, Governor Fordyce, I think, is a great governor. He's more than capable of defending his own remarks. I think the only difference that I would have with it is, and I should probably preface this by telling you that I began my political career as the executive director to the first Jewish national chairman of the college Republicans in the history of the Republican Party. I do think that you have to acknowledge the role that Jews have and will continue to play, and I think there's a commonality among Jews and Christians on a lot of these issues, because again, ultimately, it's a faith that I think has a lot of common values.
As you know, and we may hear this a bit from Congressman Leach when he comes on afterwards, the critics of the Christian Coalition, Dr. Robertson and others, suggest that it was the divisive tone, as they would put it, of your rhetoric from the Christian right that contributed, at least, and perhaps caused President Bush's defeat. Guilty as charged?
Not guilty. And I think the reason why is because, I mean, look, after any defeat, you have all kinds of post-mortem revisionism. The fact of the matter is that ABC, Washington Post, commissioned a poll on the Sunday before the election, and George Bush was trailing Bill Clinton 57 to 36%. The following Sunday, they did another poll after the convention. George Bush trailed Bill Clinton 47 to 42%, virtually within the margin of error. He got a huge post-convention bump. I mean, I think if you look at post-World War II American political history, if you want to talk about conventions that were disasters, certainly Harry Truman's convention was a disaster in '48. He didn't get up to address the delegates until 3 a.m. The Dixiecrats got up and walked out, and he won the election anyway. I don't think conventions are what decide elections. And in fact, on election day, the network exit polls showed that 64% of the voters listed not the conventions, but debate performances as the reason why they voted the way they did.
So you think the convention was a big plus for the Republicans?
It clearly pulled George Bush to within a point where he could have won the election.
When Mary Madeline, who was the #2 person in the Bush-Quayle campaign, says in the New York Times today that they were in a hole coming out of the convention because they had to disabuse people of the notion that, to use her phrase, we were a bunch of homophobic bigots. You think she's totally mistaken in that view?
Mary's a friend of mine, and I respect her views and her right to express her views. But as I said, the objective data just doesn't support the idea that the convention is why George Bush lost the election. If George Bush had been perceived going into the election as successfully managing the economy, creating jobs and creating economic growth, and had done much better in the debates, I think he would be being fitted for a tuxedo right now for his second inaugural.
And you reject the idea that there was any backlash against the kind of rhetoric or positions that were taken in the platform or from the podium at the Republican convention?
It's just not there in the exit polling. I mean, in Houston, and I was there, there were 50 speakers at the Republican convention. They included people like Lynn Martin, who's pro-choice, Pete Wilson, who's pro-choice, Bill Weld, who's pro-choice, Kay Hutchison, the treasurer of Texas, who's pro-choice. There was a diversity of views expressed from the platform and from the podium. Compare that with Madison Square Garden, where you have the spectacle of Governor Bob Casey, the governor of the fifth largest state in America, not even being allowed to speak. I don't think there was a single pro-life speaker in Madison Square Garden. I think that was an example of a litmus test and of a lack of diversity, not Houston.
Dr. Reed, I think that most of our viewers, when they think of the Christian right, think that you are pro-prayer in school, you're anti-abortion, you're anti what you view as special rights for gays. Let me talk about other parts of your agendas. I've read about them in the last week or so. Am I right that you advocate the mandatory teaching of creationism in schools wherever they teach the theory of evolution also?
We think what you need in the curriculum is balance.
The biblical version of creation.
Well, not necessarily biblical. There's plenty of scientific evidence for the idea that the Earth was created by some means other than the Big Bang. I think what I'm really saying, and what we encourage in our organization, is not something like the Scopes trial where you don't allow evolution to be presented, or something like what you have today where you don't allow creationism to happen. What we have today
if a school does evolution, they ought to do creationism.
I think you ought to have balance.
And that ought to be mandatory in public schools?
Well, I think that's something that's left to the local school boards as to how they want to present it. But again, what we're saying is you ought to have balance so that young people can be presented with all views.
Let me ask you about your organization's view of the role of women, and I want to read your quote from Pat Robertson, which was talking about marriage, and he says of marriage and of a woman, he says, "You have accepted the headship of man, your husband. Christ is the head of the household, and the husband is the head of the wife." Is that the basic view of the Christian right?
Well, what he's doing there is paraphrasing the Apostle Paul in the second letter to Corinthians, where he talks about order in the household and so forth. I think Pat Robertson is a minister of the gospel, and that's what he believes and that's what he teaches. But I think what you have to do, Al, is you have to allow him and respect his views on that matter and understand there's a distinction between that and whether or not he wants laws that would not allow women to have careers or would not allow them to achieve their highest aspirations in education and housing, employment, and so forth. I know Pat Robertson. I work with him. This is a man who has advanced women, the director of his...
So that's a personal view, not an organizational view. That doesn't have any relevance to your organization, that view of women.
I think Pat Robertson is very pro-women and promotes them in his companies.
Let me ask you about a couple other things. As you know, your organization has played a major role in states like Washington and Iowa. Some of the platform planks, just help me a little bit as to what their relevance might be to Christianity. In Washington State, at one point, they called for abolishing the practice of yoga. I don't understand what relevance that has to Christian.
I'm not really familiar with that particular platform plank. I didn't really have anything to do with writing it, but I do know that there are a lot of parents out there that are concerned with what's being referred to as the Michigan model. It was really pioneered in Michigan, and it's a curriculum that teaches children, actively teaches them a kind of a new age transcendentalism, and I don't know if it includes yoga, but there are exercises, for example, where children are told to close their eyes and imagine themselves transmigrating themselves into other bodies and so forth. And I think parents have a right to say, hey, I don't want my child being taught those kinds of things. That to me is an establishment of a religion.
One final question is, do you think that it is a Christian issue that the United States ought to get out of the United Nations? That's another platform plank.
I think the United Nations has not served the national security interests of the United States. I don't know that I would personally advocate getting out of it, but I certainly don't think it's been a very positive force.
Dr. Reed, we'll have to take a break here. We'll be right back after this message. We're back talking with Dr. Ralph Reed of Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition. Dr. Reed, what is the coalition's position on allowing gays and lesbians in the United States military?
Well, Tim, I'm not a military expert, obviously, but I think that On that issue, I would have to agree with, and I think I'm in very good company, Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, William Crowell, the immediate past chairman, who of course supported Bill Clinton, Senator Sam Nunn, a Democrat, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, have all said that they're opposed to it because it's a 48-year policy, and I think it would ultimately be deleterious to order and discipline.
How about rights of homosexuals in general?
Well, I think homosexuals, I wouldn't be against them, and we don't oppose homosexuals having jobs, running for office, being involved in the civic process, owning and renting property, and so forth. What we're against, Tim, and it's not a matter of being being against or hating homosexuals, it's a matter of what's good law. We're against sexual preference being included as a criteria for granting minority status with special rights and privileges under civil rights statutes. We think historically civil rights has been understood to mean protecting people based on age, race, national origin, gender, or disability, and that's the way we think it ought to stay.
Do you know anyone who's gay?
Yes, I sure do.
And are they welcome into the Christian Coalition?
Well, again, anybody who wants to join is certainly welcome to, but I don't know that they would join, but I wouldn't try and stop them from joining.
Is being gay a matter of biology or choice?
I think it's a matter of choice. I don't think that there's a great deal of evidence. They've got the twin studies where supposedly it's genetically based, but I don't believe that. I think people have to accept responsibility for their own actions.
John Schlafly, the son of Phyllis Schlafly, the noted conservative critic, said that it's as natural as being born left-handed or right-handed. Have you ever spoken to John Schlafly about being gay?
Never talked to him, but I've never met a left-handed person who became right-handed. I've met a lot of people who were homosexuals who changed from that lifestyle and are now happily married. And I think if it were genetic, I think that would seem to indicate that it's not. If you can change, if you can make a change in your lifestyle, how could it be genetic? It doesn't really make any sense.
The Wall Street Journal on Wednesday said that your organization had sounded a new call to arms battling what you perceive to be the spread of homosexuality across the United States. Is that accurate?
No, that piece I thought was a good piece, but in that one area I don't think it was very accurate. I think that the issues that are really, I think this is going to be a big issue in the coming years, but I don't think it's because we're making it a big issue. I think Bill Clinton is making it an issue. I think other people are making it an issue. But the kinds of things that we're talking about are things like increasing the standard deduction for children to reduce the tax burden on families, choice in education so parents can choose the school that they want to send their child to, and things like that, and we're making that our primary focus.
Why is it going to be a big issue?
Well, I think it's a big issue because the homosexual lobby is actively pushing for those kinds of laws. I think they've gotten it through in about 100 communities, and so for those who are opposed to it, like us, we have to go out there and oppose it. I mean, people forget, for example, that the reason why the initiatives were on the ballot in Colorado and Oregon in November is because Portland and Denver had passed gay rights ordinances, and so this was an effort by the people in those states to repeal those ordinances. They were reacting to what the gay lobby had already put through.
And you'll seek to repeal the ordinances in all 100 communities that have them now?
No, not necessarily. I'm just stating that is what is happening.
David Broder.
You have your doctor's degree in American history. Put on that hat for a minute and tell me why you think that those who view your effort as an effort to impose a kind of a theocratic approach on a society which has thrived through the separation of church and state are wrong.
Well, I think there are many reasons. There's a long history, I think a great and celebrated history of this country of people of faith making an enormous positive contribution to American civic life. But, people ask us...
As individuals.
And as organizations. I mean, Martin Luther King, let's remember, after the Montgomery bus boycott, called his organization the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Now, why did he do that? He did that not because he was saying that people who disagreed with him on the issue of segregation were not Christians. There were plenty of segregationists who were Christians. The reason why is because he was saying that his approach to the issue of segregation was tempered and molded by his faith, because he believed that God created all men and women with equal rights that affected the way he viewed public policy issues. So we mean it in an affirming way, not in an exclusionary way.
But when you seek to have public funds used to support education in church-related schools. Doesn't that violate the separation of church and state as you understand it?
No, David, it doesn't, any more than the GI Bill does. Under the GI Bill, which has been around since, I guess, what, 1946, veterans were given funds. The funding and the subsidy is not to church institutions, it's to individuals. You give the funds to the individual, they go spend it where they want to. And there were people in the GI Bill who went to Notre Dame, or went to Yeshiva, or went to Howard College, or went to Brigham Young. And nobody said that was a subsidy to the Catholic or the Mormon Church, and they shouldn't have, because it wasn't. It was to those individuals, and then we empowered them to make the choice.
But that law made a distinction between youngsters of elementary school age and adults who were ready to go to college, and said
but I think under a GI Bill for children, the aid would actually go to parents who are going to be the ones who will choose where their children go to school.
And you think that's perfectly consistent with the American tradition?
I not only think it's perfectly consistent, about 2/3 of the American people are in favor of it. They want choice in education.
Dr. Reed, let me ask you one quick question about abortion. Do you think abortion should be permissible in cases of rape or incest, or where the life of the mother is in danger?
Well, I think what we believe as an organization is that abortion should not be used as a form of birth control.
Should it be permissible in cases of rape or incest specifically?
Al, we favor a law that would allow for an exception to protect the mother.
But not for rape or incest?
But, let me finish, but if necessary, in order to pass a law, if it became necessary in order to build the coalition and get the votes to pass the law, we would favor, or at least we would allow rape and incest exceptions. Sure.
On that same point, William Kristol, the Vice President's Chief of Staff, is quoted in this week's New Republic as saying, "No one's going to try to hold to the 1992 abortion language in the Republican platform." Do you agree with that?
I haven't seen the article yet. I mean, Bill's a friend of mine, but I think the language, if anybody's read it, and unfortunately there aren't very many who have, it's actually a very good statement. What it says is that we need a human life amendment to protect the unborn. We shouldn't provide tax subsidies to organizations that perform abortion, and we need to provide humane alternatives to abortion like adoption services. I think that's mainstream language supported by mainstream Americans.
Do you have any problem with Lynn Martin, who's pro-abortion rights, becoming chairman of the Republican Party?
Well, I think Lynn Martin's a good Republican. She worked hard for this ticket in 1992. When she ran for the Senate in 1990, she was supported by a lot of pro-family conservatives, but Tim, we're not going to take a position on the chairman's race.
But as a symbol, you have no problem with a pro-abortion rights woman heading the Republican Party?
Well, I'm not going to talk about it in the context of the chairman's race because we're not going to take a position on the chairman's race.
Dr. Reed, thanks for joining us this morning on Meet the Press.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll be right back after this message. We'll talk about the struggle for the soul of the Republican Party, but first, this brief news update.
The United States seems to be getting closer to sending troops into Somalia. While 2 million people there face starvation and thousands of sacks of food lay in a warehouse, the United Nations is considering an American offer to send in up to 30,000 troops. The two groups fighting for control of Mogadishu, the capital, say that they would welcome American troops. Residents of one town in Bosnia are celebrating this weekend. The town of Srebrenica received its first supplies. Since the civil war began 7 months ago, a United Nations convoy of 20 trucks delivered food, blankets, and children's clothing to more than 70,000 Muslim residents of the city who had been living on potatoes, beans, and bread. Police in Venezuela enforced a dusk-to-dawn curfew for the second consecutive night. It was part of the crackdown that followed a rebel attempt to overthrow that government. There was scattered violence reported yesterday. A rebel aircraft strafed the presidential palace, but it was shot down. The crew members died. Hundreds of rebel soldiers were arrested, and the government said that they would all be placed on trial. Black gunmen burst into a country club in South Africa, and they fired automatic weapons at whites who were eating dinner. They killed 4 people and wounded at least 17. The attack occurred in the southern city of King Williamstown. A witness there said that there were 3 gunmen who entered the club and then opened fire on about 60 people who were in the dining area. The attackers also threw hand grenades. The New York Times is reporting today that Texas Senator Phil Gramm may have had a conflict of interest in dealings with a Dallas contractor. The contractor rebuilt Mr. Gramm's vacation home, but only charged the Republican senator half the cost. 1 year later, the contractor, who owned several savings and loans associations that failed, sought Senator Graham's advice about federal regulators. The newspaper raises questions about Mr. Graham's giving advice about an industry he oversees as a leading member of the Senate Banking Committee. That's the news this Sunday. Back to Tim Russert in Washington.
We'll have questions for our next guest, Republican Congressman Jim Leach of Iowa, when Meet the Press continues after the station break. Welcome back to the second half of Meet the Press. Joining us now, Republican Congressman Jim Leach of Iowa, founder of the Republican Mainstream Committee. Congressman, good morning.
Good morning, Tim.
And with me is David Broder of the Washington Post, Al Hunt of the Wall Street Journal. Congressman, did the convention in Houston have anything to do with George Bush's defeat?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons for the president's defeat, but one is that the Republican Party appeared to be getting narrowly parochial, while the Democratic Party appeared to be moving to the center, and that had certainly a serious effect on the election.
Do you agree with Mary Madeline, the Bush-Quayle campaign that David cited earlier, that she spent a lot of her time denying the Republican Party was a bunch of homophobic bigots?
Well, I don't know how she spent her time, but I would say that there is an issue of tolerance in American public life, and that issue has to be dealt with. And it is wrong for any political party to give a perception, in reality or otherwise, of being a party that's exclusive of any major segment of our society.
How would you change the Republican Party platform to reflect that?
Well, I think that the Republicans ought to put an emphasis on constitutionalism, an ethic of individual rights and tolerance. And the Republican Party, if it's going to have a future that's viable, has got to be a party of principle, of pragmatism, one that recognizes what the Republican traditions are. And those traditions are very individual rights oriented, and they're very tolerant.
So you would be pro-abortion rights in your platform?
My own personal feeling is that you should look at this issue as one between an individual and their church, not something that should be decided in the political framework. Having said that, I think a party recognizing that there are lots and lots of diversity perhaps should be silent on the issue. But it should not be narrowly one-sided.
How about the issue of gay rights?
Well, I think that as a country, we have to recognize that people are different. And so at issue is individual rights and individual prerogatives within a framework of social obligation. And my sense is that any party that gives the image of prejudice is a party that can spread that prejudice beyond one sector to many other sectors. In fact, this issue of prejudice is really the largest issue in the world today in many regards, whether it be in Germany, we're seeing prejudice against immigrants. In other countries, we're seeing prejudice based upon religion. And I think we ought to be doing our very best to uplift rather than to narrowly try to discriminate.
Reverend Pat Robertson and Dr. Ralph Reed, who was just on our program, have said the Republicans had the exact same platform in 80, 84, and 88, and they won. Reverend Robertson went further. He said that I don't see how you can take out the evangelicals out of the Republican Party and have anything left. That 60% of the evangelicals voted for George Bush, which is his best performance amongst any subgroup. Doesn't he have a point?
Well, I think he does have a point.
They are loyal Republicans.
They are loyal Republicans, and I think he also has a point that, in essence, the strategy in 1992 was not radically different than the strategy in 88, 84, and 80, which were winning strategies. Having said that, there was something that changed, and the something that changed was circumstance. It appeared to many in the public that the Republicans had opened their tent to socioeconomic and religious groups that had not been particularly identified with the Republican Party. And these groups not unnaturally felt that not only was the tent to be open, that they should play a part, and that's a very understandable phenomenon. But it came to be perceived by the public that they came to play a dominant role, and it also came to be perceived by the public that their agenda was very close to fruition, that one or two more appointments to the Supreme Court might make a very different circumstance on, for example, the abortion issue. And so the public, in kind of a counter-reaction, said, maybe this has gone a little bit too far, and maybe As much as we have great moral issues in politics and morality stems from religion, by the same token we have a tradition of separation of church and state. And that shouldn't we keep that tradition where it is?
Have you ever spoken about this issue with George Bush?
I have not spoken about it in the context that you have just raised it. Certainly, I argued very strenuously that the face of the Republican convention should be a little bit different than perhaps occurred.
Did you speak to the president post-convention in Houston?
No, I had not on that subject.
Did you spoke to him since he lost?
I have not even spoken since he lost. He's a fine friend, and I grieve for his circumstance.
David Broder.
Is there a fight going on for control of the Republican Party?
There is, there always has been, and there always will be, and that's true in the Democratic Party as well. It takes on different dimensions. What's different is that the old fight used to be between the Scranton-Goldwater wing of the party and the Scranton-Rockefeller wing and the Goldwater wing. Now those two wings are kind of merging together as kind of traditional republicanism, and the new fight is between traditional Republicans and new entrants in the Republican fold that have a little bit more of a religious infusion of idea and format.
Now, your side lost that fight in Iowa.
It surely did, as a party.
Why did you lose?
Basically speaking, because the new entrants to the party are more disciplined, they're more organized, and they're more committed.
So your argument is not with them, but with your own allies, that they didn't do their job?
I think the moderate wing of the party has lit the Republican Party down very dramatically. And I think one should respect people with a little different feeling, and people that get involved have to be respected. Now, whether there's total agreement is another matter. But that's where, I mean, tolerance is key between groups and also between political parties.
Do you find the people who've taken over tolerant or intolerant?
I find some of the issues that they have articulated not to my liking. On the other hand, I will tell you frankly, David, just like in Georgia, where people supported a Republican candidate who was not exactly of their liking, these groups in Iowa didn't desert the party, and they supported people in the moderate as well as the conservative wing of the party, so it's not totally intolerant.
You heard Dr. Reed say that Martin Luther King had operated as called his organization the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. You have no problem then with Christians acknowledging their Christianity and using that as the basis for organizing in the political arena?
Well, the first half is, of course, reasonable. A Christian can articulate their Christianity. I happen to be of the kind of wing of the party that, or of I guess I should say Christianity, that looks to the Sermon on the Mount, where Christ, who Christians look to for spiritual guidance, said to be very cautious about praying in public. And he said, go to your room and pray to your Father in secret, and in secret your Father will hear you. Having said that, I believe that the history of America is one that the fathers of our founding fathers came to these shores to avoid religious persecution, and the founding fathers established a religious society in which the institutions of our country were imbued with a faith in a supreme being. But our tradition is Judeo-Christian. Beyond that, it's based upon religious pluralism. We, in our amendments to the Constitution, in all of the writings of the Founding Fathers, almost without exception, wanted to make it very clear that religious faith would be freely exercised in this country. And then Madison argued, and I think this is awfully important, who does not see, Madison said, that the same kind of people or authority that could establish Christianity in exclusion of all faiths could then not establish a particular sect of Christianity in exclusion of other sects. And that's why we did not establish ourselves as a single church state, but a state based upon religious freedom.
Congressman, I can't possibly see how you and the religious right can make common ground, hearing you this morning and hearing Dr. Reed this morning. Tony Dolan, a conservative speechwriter for Ronald Reagan, referred to you as, he likened you to those, quote, pesto sauce, BMW, blame America first Democrats. Wouldn't you be more comfortable really as a Democrat?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, I think you have to recognize that political parties are traditions that are based on traditions that aren't easily changed. And that Republican tradition, we're a party born of the Civil War, to stopping the greatest sin of prejudice in mankind, slavery. We're a party that stressed individual rights, and we stress kind of the individual as contrasted with governmental activism. I think that's a party and a precept that I can well identify with. And I would also stress that what you see in the Christian right is a organization of people that feel powerless, not totally dissimilar to whether it be the organization of Afro-Americans, whether it be the organization of women in politics. And one doesn't always identify with the leaders of these movements, but one can totally sympathize with the movements.
Well, let me ask you this. If the Clinton administration were to offer you a high post, would you be receptive?
Well, first, I would find that not in the cards.
Well, they say they're looking for prominent Republicans.
Well, they have not contacted me, and I am very happy doing what I am doing now, and I cannot believe that I would be interested. Now,
that's a Sherman-esque no, then.
It's a very Sherman-esque no.
All right, let me look ahead for a second to 1996. You're talking about your wing of the party. Are there any of the potential candidates that people talk about now that you think are, really constitute your kind of Republican?
Well, I think you'll see in 1996 a panoply of Republican candidates. I think perhaps like 1980, we had 8 or 9 candidates out of the box, and then it got whittled down over time. It's interesting where on the spectrum people are moving. A few years ago, Jack Kemp was to the right of Ronald Reagan. He was the cutting-edge right political figure in the country. Today, he's in the left-to-center mode in the Republican Party.
Is he your kind of Republican, Jack Kemp?
Well, he'd be one I would respect. I think Bill Weld would be a fine candidate. There are going to be a number of candidates emerge, some of whom you may not be speculating about today.
Like whom?
Oh, you could see candidates come out of the Senate, come out of the House of Representatives, come out of the governorships, and I, for one, think that it is remarkable that more candidates haven't come out of the private sector, whether it be university presidents, whether it be business leadership. Now,
is Jim Leach thinking about it?
I haven't sensed a groundswell, but I appreciate your concern.
Let me ask
my mother, who is in heaven, would appreciate that, yes.
You were asked about 10 days ago if you could support Pat Robertson as president, and you said you wouldn't be your first choice, but yes. Isn't that putting party above principle?
Well, I said he would not be my first choice.
But you would support Pat Robertson for president?
I would look carefully at what Pat had to say. He holds a number of views that I don't frankly agree with. And some are in the separation of church and state area. Some are frankly very pragmatic issues of how you conduct a country's leadership abroad. I'm very concerned, for example, about the future of the United Nations. I think it's essential that as a society that we develop more, not less, international law. And Pat has come out against the expansion of international law under the United Nations, and I'd find that very difficult. On the other hand, there are some areas that we might find some common ground, probably in economic policy particularly.
You are a former Foreign Service officer. 2 quick questions on that. What's your reaction to the State Department investigation involving ruffling through Bill Clinton and his mother's files at the State Department?
I am frankly just appalled. This is a violation of enormous significance. It's using the power of the government in the realm of individual privacy. And not only of Bill Clinton, apparently even Ross Perot. I think it's wrong. I will say one of the most extraordinary things, and I don't mean to try to balance it, that occurred in this election that's gotten almost no public attention in terms of perspective, is that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, in effect, ran a sting operation on the President of the United States. If the FBI had run a sting operation on one of the challenging candidates, it would have been particularly significant, but it's still not insignificant that they ran a sting on the president's campaign.
We have about 30 seconds, Congressman. As a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, what should the United States be doing about Somalia? Should we commit 30,000 troops to help guarantee the distribution of food in that country?
The United States of America has always come to the aid of people that are starving. We should continue to. If providing food is not enough because it's not being distributed, we should do everything in our power to see that that food gets distributed. If it takes sending some armed forces commitment to do that, it should be done.
Congressman Leach, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us this morning on Meet the Press.
Thank you, Tim.
And in a moment, we'll be back to talk about the economy, Somalia, and the perils of Packwood. We're back with David Broder and Al Hunt, and joining us now is Jodie Allen, editor of the Sunday Outlook section of the Washington Post. Jodie, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Tim.
Bill Clinton, Clintonomics, the economy, an economic summit coming in Little Rock. How big of a problem is the economy going to be for Bill Clinton? Can he carry out his campaign promises? What can we expect?
Well, I think it's, at least at the moment, it doesn't look like it's going to be as big of a problem as it might be. I think that he has said he's cautiously optimistic and has a wait-and-see attitude, but it's certainly looking better. I mean, we've had this very good third quarter of growth. We've got more good news lately, home sales up, commercial banks expanding loans. If this keeps up, it may not, it'll take a lot of pressure off Clinton. It should make things a good deal easier for him.
You don't think we'll need a stimulus package that he's been talking about?
Well, I think that the thought of a stimulus package was always a very difficult one. People really don't know how to stimulate the economy as well as the economists might want you to believe, especially now when the world has changed. If you pull the old triggers like quick tax cut, well, a lot of that money goes abroad in buying imports, for example, and tax credits for business, for example. A lot of that goes into equipment rather than into creating jobs now so they can become more competitive. It's not so easy to create jobs unless you try to do it in direct ways.
He's planning a town meeting, an economic summit in Little Rock, December 14, 15. Will they have a Secretary of Treasury in place by then, and what kind of person are they looking for?
Well, I think that the first criteria, and I don't know whether they will, but I would think that they would like very much to, and I would think that the first criterion would be to pick somebody that would make Wall Street feel happy. I mean, they want to keep interest rates low. They don't want the bond buyers to get nervous. They don't want the Fed to get nervous. And so they want somebody who's going to have that nice, solid look about him. And I think that would be a good thing to have in place, although I don't see this town meeting as primarily a policy-making thing. This is show and tell. This is a message I care, but presumably better handled than Bush handled it.
Albert, message. Are we seeing in the Clinton transition and presidency more based on the model of Ronald Reagan than Jimmy Carter? A lot of imagery, a lot of walking through malls and feel good, touch good, that kind of thing?
They sure hope so. They sure hope it's Ronald Reagan and not Jimmy Carter. I don't think there's any question of that. Look, I think the president-elect has done very well in the 3.5 weeks since the election, but I'm not sure that the whole group has done quite as well. I'm not sure there really is any message or theme coming out. Maybe that's not important right now. Maybe it's too early. But I think going back to what Jodie said a minute ago, those problems are going to be quite acute next year. And it's true the economy's doing better, but we're not sure if it's producing jobs yet. And a year from now, if the economy's doing well, but it hadn't produced jobs, Bill Clinton, as George Bush would say, will be in deep doo-doo.
David Broder, how's Bill Clinton doing?
He's doing fine, but it's all symbolism so far. He does the symbolism extremely well. But the economic indicators that Jodie was talking about now pose a really interesting and tough intellectual and political challenge for this president. He had a nice formula for what he was going to do that was based on the partisan interpretation of economic statistics during the campaign. Now the statistics are changing and there's less need for partisanship, and the first test of Bill Clinton is whether he is willing to adapt his program to his current perception of reality. If he is, then there'll be less short-term stimulus, more emphasis on long-term investment and budget discipline. And I think if he does that second route, he's got a chance not only to get Democratic support, but to get bipartisan support in the Congress. But this is a real test for him now.
George Bush, the better the economy gets, the worse he must feel, in a crazy, ironic way. Here was a president who lost this election, many say, based on the economy, and things seem to have picked up on his watch. Jodie?
Oh, yes, there's no question that if this is a real recovery, and it's important to remember that the numbers have firmed up twice before in the last year and a half. These numbers are awfully good, though. He kept trying to tell us that. It sounded awful lame after all these years of very, very slow growth or even downturn. So he couldn't get his message across. But, yeah, there's a certain irony here.
Which Bill Clinton will we see? David framed the issue. Will we see one who accepts reality as it now is, or try to adhere to his campaign promises, even though the facts may have changed?
Well, I think that Clinton's a pretty smart man from what we've seen so far, and there will be a lot of pressure on him just to deliver on, well, you said you'd do job-creating things and so on, but just in the noises that he's been making so far, saying, you know, let's wait and see, that sounds good. It looks like he is willing to look at the long term if he can afford to do that, and it would be, of course, very good for the country if he could.
We're going to leave it here. We'll take a break. We'll be back in just a minute. We're back. Senator Robert Packwood of Oregon. 10 women have come forward suggesting allegations of sexual harassment. Senator Packwood has now said part of his problem may revolve around drinking. Jody, what do you make of this? Is the Senate in for a major change in their attitude towards women?
Well, this will be another step along the way to a change in attitude. There's no question about it. I think it's already begun. What we're looking at here is perhaps the end of what was business as usual for, well, not as usual, but at least not totally, there was a culture there, I think, of sort of easygoing attitudes towards women, and that they're maturing slowly, and some old things are coming back to haunt them. A lot of these allegations against Packwood are pretty old, but I think, yeah, this is part of a real change.
Albert Hunt, can Bob Packwood survive this?
Oh, he certainly will never be the senator that he once was as far as influence is concerned. Whether he can stay in the Senate or not, I think may even be an open question. I think Anita Hill, and I think those now 6 women in the Senate have changed. And Tim, let's understand, we're not just talking about, you know, the question of womanizing, if you will. This is sexual harassment. This is 21, 22-year-old staffers. The charges are lobbyists, people who really were the powerless. And I think this is very serious. And there's a question whether he told the truth to the Washington Post, as a matter of fact.
David Broder.
Congress has no choice but to look at the way in which the power relationship, as Al puts it, has been exploited. It's not unknown. It's been a part of a pattern up there, not prevalent, but certainly a number of cases, and they have no choice now but to look at it. Interesting footnote on this thing. The women who have now been elected to the Senate are being very reluctant to take posts on the Judiciary Committee or on the Senate Ethics Committee. They have to step up to that challenge. It's not theirs alone, but it is certainly in part theirs, and they have to face up to that challenge.
Elected on those issues, use them as a centerpiece of the campaign, and now avoiding some of the responsibility. Interesting issue to be discussed in weeks ahead. Jodie Allen, thank you. Al Hunt, David Broder. That's all for today. We'll be back next week. If it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press. See you then.